Okay, we have just finished up our, the last video was on flowering plants and their fruits, but I left one out that I meant to tell you about. This is a wisteria from my garden. It's right behind me, and it's just beginning to fade. The flowers are falling off, and at the base of each flower now is a very new young pea pod that's about to grow and develop the seeds inside. So this is the fruit of the wisteria plant, and as we go into summer and fall, that fruit will become this big pea pod that held, you can see in these little depressions, you can see where it held a roundish flat brown seed. And when this fruit was ripe, what it did was twist and mechanically spray the seed out. And so once again, an example of fruits being involved in seed dispersal as their main function for flowering plants. Another great adaptation that allowed them to survive and grow and reproduce on land. So before we move on, if you haven't already chosen a fruit to sketch, I'd like you to do that. You could choose this one here, which is in the slideshow. You could back up on the past little video and look at some of the fruits there. You might have a fruit in your kitchen that you could draw, or a fruit that you have found on your socks if you've just been on one of your neighborhood walks. So take a pause, do pause if you haven't done that yet. Sketch a fruit to remind you that the main job of fruits is for dispersal. And let's now move on to our next topic, which is adaptive radiation and coevolution. So we know that flowering plants went through this major diversification burst between about 100 million years ago and 80 million years ago. And that seems like a long time and a long period, but it's really short in terms of evolutionary history. And so we call these rapid speciation bursts, we call them adaptive radiation. Speciation is the formation of new species, and there's couple different situations, several different situations that could cause adaptive radiation. And one of these, the one that's most relevant to flowering plants, is this idea that a new adaptation increases survival, growth, and reproduction. And so if we start out with sort of an ancestral flowering plant here, and we see that it's sort of one species, it can diversify into many, many different species, and then these can each diversify, and these can diversify, and so that what you have from an original flowering plant is many, many different species. So this is sort of the y-axis here would be time. So what was this adaptation that gave flowering plants the ability to radiate adaptively to make so many new species? Well, a very good hypothesis is that flowers were the structure that arose that enabled them to really diversify. Flowers mean that pollination is way more efficient. So because you can direct your pollen to a certain pollinator that will then carry it to the next flower. So remember in the last video we saw wind pollination by gymnosperms, a whole bunch of pollen blown in the wind, and that's very inefficient because the vast majority won't make it to another flower, and it's expensive to make pollen. So flowers that could then draw, attract a pollinator were much more efficient and began to specialize in these different niches. So some flowers adapted towards attracting this kind of pollinator, and other flowers adapted towards attracting this kind of pollinator. And so we think that that specialization of niches drove at least some degree of the explosion of both insect species and flowering species that we see today. So related to this topic is concept, which is that of coevolution. And this is when the evolution of one species affects the evolution of another species. So flowering plants with long red tubes are specialized to give hummingbirds almost exclusive access to their nectar. It's not entirely, because there are some bumblebees that will go in and bore little holes in the flowers and then get the nectar without even getting the pollen. And there are so many examples of orchids that mimic the insects that exclusively pollinate them. Many flowers have UV nectar guides for insects and birds. We're going to stop here because the next video I want you to watch is has lots of images of these, and a fellow who's going to tell you all about the sex lives of plants. He's quite a nerd, and it's kind of fun to watch. So I hope you enjoyed that next video. We'll meet again to talk about specializations of California plants.